It's my pleasure to introduce, but it was the case some minutes ago, Professor Philip Potter from the National Security Policy Center, and directly from the United States now with us. So, dear Philip, the floor is yours with a transition. Thank you very much again for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, and very sorry I cannot be there in person. I would much rather be sitting in the room with you than sitting here in Virginia. My name is Phil Potter. I'm director of the National Security Policy Center at the University of Virginia, and very excited to be contributing to this conversation. I'm going to keep my comments relatively brief. Over the last several months to years, I think everybody's pretty sick of Zoom presentations, and so I don't want to take away from the atmosphere you have in the room too much. So let me put some thoughts on paper or on the record, so to speak, and then we can hopefully have a bit of a conversation about it during the Q&A. So this is sort of a fortuitous placement for my comments. We've talked a little bit, and I'm sure you've already been talking quite a lot about the recent Russian direct ASAT tests, and then on the one hand, and then on the other, we just heard quite a bit about sort of the nature of the debris problem, particularly with regard to congestion, right? And so from my standpoint, there's sort of two aspects of the debris problem that I'd like to highlight. There are additional aspects, but I think we can have an interesting dichotomy between two of those. One of those is indeed this congestion and traffic management problem. There's just a lot of stuff, right? And it's getting, as was just demonstrated graphically and with data, it's getting worse, right? And we're all aware that it's getting quite a lot worse, and the future is one of complexity and congestion. The second one of these problems of debris is, I would say, quite a different one, right? Which is a problem of tests, of aggression, and of accidents, right? And so you have two essential problems: the stuff that's there on purpose and the stuff that's there by accident, okay? And those two things intersect in ways that create a highly complex physical environment, but also a highly complex policy environment. The physical environment is one, and in terms of sort of traffic management and that sort of thing, as we were just discussing, is something we might be addressing in bilateral ways, in multilateral ways, with international institutions, with data sharing. There are technical components to this. The policy element is, I would argue, quite a lot more challenging, right? And in particular, the way that policymakers, particularly in the US, have been sort of thinking about this recently is in terms of deterrence postures, right? What can be done to deter the types of, as they're being sort of called, irresponsible behaviors that can lead to an even more challenging environment than the one that we already face, right? So what can be done, for example, to deter a Russian test that creates a debris field that is a threat to the International Space Station in advance of that occurring? And so, I think when we take a step back and sort of consider the Russian test, of course, information is still kind of coming in about that. We're still kind of getting our heads around it. But there are two essential reasons why a state would do something like that, right? One would be to demonstrate a capability, and the other would be to demonstrate the resolve to use a capability. I think we're all, again, we're still kind of getting our heads around exactly what's occurred, and we're subject to what's available in the public space and all that. But from my standpoint, there's very little that's surprising about the notion that Russia would have this capability. I think we sort of knew that Russia had this capability, and so that leaves us in a place where we say, okay, this appears to have more to do with the demonstration of resolve to use that capability, a brushback, so to speak, in terms of Russian interests. And that is congruent, again, we're all figuring this out in real time, but it's congruent with this notion that, hey, this is more connected to things that are happening terrestrially on the ground politically right here and right now than it has to do with a debut of novel technology, all right? And so that then kind of steps us back an additional level, which is if you're going to deter that type of demonstration, it has to be costly. All right. And this is a lot of where the international system has been, and sort of in terms of calling out these irresponsible behaviors in ways that are designed to raise the costs for actors who would employ them. Now, clearly in this instance, those costs were not raised to a sufficiently high level where deterrence took place. The event occurred, the damage is done in some sense. All right. But one way or the other, sort of unification of that calling out process of sort of international consensus about what is and what is not a responsible behavior is a really important thing to be able to do. All right. And a lot of that is going on in terms of international engagements between countries. One thing that I want to sort of point the way to and sort of have this group think about a little bit is the role for the sort of those outside of government and those outside of industry, and particularly the role of sort of academia and analysts in understanding what is actually occurring historically as well as in the present moment, right? But it doesn't need to be a cutting edge, real time sort of thing in order to actually define what is normal behavior. And so what I'm getting at here is that because our sort of academic understanding, our kind of unclassified, open source, published in the journals kind of information about space situational awareness just really isn't there. It's very hard for us to do the sorts of things that, you know, I'm trained as a political scientist, right? This is sort of the domain I normally operate in when it comes to terrestrial conflict, state violence, militant violence, whatever it might be. We think about the events that have occurred and the correlates of those events in order to better understand the behavior that gives rise to certain outcomes, okay? What I'd like to sort of put on the table for the group to consider is that when it comes to space, despite this being a domain we've been operating in for quite a while, we're in our infancy there, right? Scholars have no data at their disposal, which is easily manipulated alongside terrestrial correlates that would allow us to say, huh, interesting, when this happens on the ground or when this happens politically, we see these sorts of events occur on orbit. Or alternatively, this is the standard pattern of behavior on orbit that has emerged over time. And I am therefore able to deduce by looking at events, hey, this is aberrant behavior. This is something that is outside the norm. This is something that we could reach consensus on the process of calling out. Okay. And that's something that we have done multiple times in other areas. And part of what I think makes space so different and so challenging is this element of remoteness, right? And this is where I think this whole problem is coming from, but the data that's coming in is allowing us to maybe begin the process of transcending it. But if you think about sort of the emergence of expectations and norms on the high seas, a parallel that is very often drawn, right? If you think about the sort of density of observed interaction on the high seas over, you know, the hundreds of years in which our norms were developed, you know, those come very fast and furious, and they're there for all to observe, right? Because it's occurring out in the open. The remoteness of space and the nationalization and compartmentalization of the information about space makes the emergence of that broadly shared situational awareness really hard to come by, all right? And so part of what we're thinking about as a group at the University of Virginia is sort of what we can do to improve on that status quo in order to contribute to sort of a general academic commons with regard to space situational awareness. And so we want to be able to address these challenges that sort of normal and abnormal actions are not clearly defined, all right? And to the extent that they are, they're defined theoretically, right? They're not defined in terms of what actual behaviors are occurring. Intelligence sharing, for all of these reasons, is very difficult, right? We don't have the, it's very sticky, it's very challenging, it's very hard to share information across countries when we're talking about governmental information. And so, well, what if we think a little bit about non-governmental information? Tracking databases are correspondingly classified and therefore very hard to sort of push out into the academic community, or even more of a problem, non-standardized. So there is actually quite a lot of information that is available historically on what goes on in space, but the formats are non-standardized, and they're not particularly friendly for comparing things in space to things that are political, things that are on Earth, whatever it might be. And so as a consequence, the kind of insights that allow us to build up a deterrent framework, shared understanding in the way that we did, for example, at the beginning of the Cold War, it's lagging, right? It's very, very slow to emerge. So as part of this process, we've been engaged in sort of a mass collection of available open source data, and are using folks from computer science and engineering and various other disciplines to help us coordinate these data, make them consistent, and put them in various formats that allow us to do these sorts of tasks. From that, we're using various algorithms to identify and code outlier behavior, right? So what's different, right? If you think of this as a massive data project, most of it is roughly congruent within tolerances of patterns we see, and then you see outliers in that. Those are things that we can then explore as interesting incidents. They are often driven by accidents, they're often driven by technological change, they can be driven by policy change. But either way, they're things that we want to understand those aberrations in order to sort of establish patterns and develop sort of what we think of as kind of correlates of outcome in space. And the notion here is that we would eventually sort of put all of this out there in the public so that the community of scholars working on these kinds of questions have fodder for understanding, right? And so some of this comes down to the fact that at the same time as we're thinking about sort of the bleeding edge in terms of what is happening in space, in policy, right here, right now, if we care about those things, we also need to be backfilling an understanding of how policy and the domain have interacted historically speaking. In the US, we often will talk about sort of the difference between situational awareness, space situational awareness, and space domain awareness. And that latter part kind of comes from layering on an understanding of other actors, of their intent, of the policy environment in order to understand what is both occurring, why it is occurring, and what is likely to occur to follow. The proposition is that if you don't have an understanding of how these variables have interacted historically, it's very unlikely you're going to be able to do that in real time. And so the sort of key components of this are movements of items on orbit, critical space events, right, sort of breaks that occur, but then linking this to terrestrial things, the public rhetoric around environment, around capabilities, stated policies from countries, known technological capability shifts, these sorts of things. And so this is going to let us do a few things, right? It's going to let us have a sense of what the status quo is, right? Where are we now, so that we have a better sense of baseline for interpreting change, right? So when aberrant behaviors or seemingly aberrant behaviors, such as a ASAT test or something along those lines occur, we're better able to say, hey, this is outside the norm of responsible behavior. This isn't something we see typically, right? It's going to better allow us to think about intentions and attribution, right? What's actually going on here. And I think most crucially, it's a key part of understanding escalation, right? What are the dimensions of these interactions that contribute to the action and counteraction, right? The response, the escalation, which is what, in the end, an awful lot of us care about. So basic challenges here, which I think are familiar to many of the people in this room who kind of deal in this world, many data sources, many formats, a lot of incompleteness. We're playing with a lot of different approaches to imputing and dealing with missing data in order to sort of understand the environment in a composite way. There's always going to be this gap between what we're able to do with this effort and the very cutting edge in terms of what is happening right now, right? Personally, and we can argue about this and have an informed debate. Personally, I'm okay with that. I think that having a sense of what occurred recently is sufficient to tell us a great deal about particularly the policy and intent and the nature of escalation in this domain, even moving forward, right? But as we often see, there is this kind of space that emerges between what is necessarily in the sort of classified national domains versus what can be out in the open source shared academic domain. And then finally, there is always this issue, and I think this was very clearly alluded to in the last talk, that the environment is rapidly evolving, right? Information changes, the pace of change in this domain is really marvelous. And a lot of that is a very hopeful thing, right? The amount of kind of technical innovation that's occurring that could be to all of our benefit is remarkable. At the same time, you do run the risk that technological change, that the policy changes surrounding that technological change could lead to sort of structural breaks that do make the past perhaps less relevant to the present than we might be assuming. All right. And then just in terms of sort of the how pressing this need is, we saw a whole set of other pictures that kind of drove home the same point. But this is an escalating situation, right? This is simply the number of satellites launched by a nation per decade. We see this sort of jumping through the roof, so to speak. Breakdown of US satellites launched by operator category. Again, commercial is way out in front of this these days. And so one of the key things that I think this project points to, and I'll leave you with sort of something to think about, is the extent to which, you know, if actors within government don't start sharing across governments, actors in academia and industry don't start sharing across, a lot of this kind of situational awareness becomes really deeply siloed, right? Industry is going to need to be able to know what's going on up there on their own. And so if nobody else contributes to this, they're going to do it on their own. And I think the implications for that and sort of that in terms of what it means to have the situational awareness concentrated in the same commercial actors who are putting these assets in space, you know, to draw a sort of tortured analogy, I think we've learned a little bit from, for example, the way social media has emerged, right? Where the best information about what is going on is controlled by the same actors who are doing most of the activity, right? And that is, you know, obviously going to be part of the story, just given the resources in play, but it can also lead to sort of certain pathologies in the policy process and informed debate that I think we really want to consider when it comes to the space domain. I don't have a perfect solution to that problem, but I certainly think that it's something we want to be considering as we look at a world where the domain is increasingly driven by industry rather than governments. So I'll leave it there and happy to engage in the Q&A and looking forward to what the other panelists have to say today.
Thank you very much, Philip. The Q&A will be for sure at the end of the panel. That was really insightful, and thank you for this, especially from what you call the academic insights lag. That's really interesting, and I'm sure we will come back on this.